Hey team, welcome to episode 129 of Transition Talk, where we talk about dental transitions and how to navigate the sometimes messy path to practice ownership. When searching for the right practice opportunity, the due diligence process can help provide reassurance you're making the right choice. I think it's critical. It involves researching and analyzing pertinent information about the seller, the practice, all of which allow you to be better equipped to make an informed decision about the opportunity. Charles and NDP's transition consultant, August Sandy, take the lead on this episode to talk about all things due diligence. It is what our team does best, and it's important for you to understand what goes into it. So take it away, guys.
All right. Well, thank you, Christy, for that warm introduction. As always, man, I am fortunate to be with the beautiful, the talented, the analyst, August Sandy. So welcome to the Transition Podcast, August.
Yes, thank you so much.
We were talking about this kind of pre-rehearsal of this recording, and I just got more and more excited just to lead this interview. But before we dive into today's topic of kind of this detail of the analyst role that you play here at NDP, I want to know a little bit about you. Tell our listeners a little bit about you and your role here and kind of how you got started. I know there was a little bit of Keen Water connection, and then obviously we got connected here at NDP. So tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I am born and raised in Dallas. So I'm a Texas girl at heart. I graduated from Texas A&M with a degree in economics. And then, like you said, I started as an intern in the tax department at Keen Waters before I found my way to NDP. So I've been an analyst here since the beginning of 2024.
So you're pretty smart, just so you know. I know you finished 3.5 years. You worked in our tax department, as you said. I remember Christy telling me a little bit about you. And of course, I didn't know you in the tax department, so no offense. I didn't know you as an intern. And so I did some little deep dive on you before we even did the interview. So I actually interviewed the tax managers and even the administrative team there at the tax department. I said, what do you know about this August Sandy? And they are like, we love her. We want her back. She is just an outstanding 100%. And so I'm like, all right, Christy, I've done my due diligence. You got to do your own gig. And so, no, we are very, very fortunate to have you in your team. Now, economics, that typically accounting, tax. So that's got to say something to the A&M business program.
Yeah, A&M has a great business school, great economics program, very well versed, a lot of connections there. So, I mean, I loved my time at A&M, and I think it's really paved the way to where I'm at now.
I know they have a very high success rate with their accounting department as far as passing CPA. So it does not surprise me that the business department would say, hey, you're going to be heavily focused on the accounting role. So do you fit in perfectly reading tax returns? And that is, obviously working in our tax department, that type of history. So it's been fantastic. You've been awesome to have. Now, let me ask you another question, because this is before we get going here. Would you say you're a high pulse, low pulse? What would you say?
I say that I can keep my cool. I think I'm pretty level-headed. I do think there's a lot of emotions that go into the everyday world of transitions, but I do think I can always kind of sit, breathe, and think like, what's the next plan? And kind of without freaking out about it. So I think that's really helped me in this role so far. So definitely low pulse.
I'm not looking at your Apple Watch, but I'm pretty sure August is running about a 48 to 50 here, team. I promise you this. And it made me think about how important that aspect is in this role as a consultant. I even think about my Keen Waters team members here that run the planning. You have to be a calm individual because the client is always going through a storm. It's the first storm they have ever gone through. So it's important for your role is to be patient, let them kind of voice out all of their concerns, and then to be able to kind of keep them back on track. So remember, when you find this amazing deal, don't mess it up. You're the one that's going to mess it up. We're not messing it up. You're messing it up. But part of our role is to kind of keep you on track. So, all right, let's dive in. So being a financial analyst here on the NDP team, this is primarily helping both buyers and sellers, but we're going to focus a little bit more on the buyer today. Certainly this process, as you're doing seller consulting and looking at the seller's financials, we're doing this exact same thing from this due diligence. Our transition department does the exact same thing when we're going to be doing a evaluation of a business. So what is your definition of what does this really mean when you're thinking like due diligence process? What does that mean to you, August?
So due diligence really means education and just making the buyer well-versed in everything about the practice that they're stepping into. So going in as the owner, you really want to know the ins and outs of this practice, not just financially, but also kind of the more fluffy things like operational items, relationships with staff, and all things like that. So really just making sure you're thinking about all the right things, asking all the right questions so you're ready to step into that practice.
I love education there. I think that is probably the principles of what NDP stands for. When you think about all of our educational content we put, even from this podcast to lectures we may do. So I think it's important. So you spend a lot of time basically educating this buyer, but what are things that you think about, or give us an example of some of the detail that perhaps the buyer is not looking at when you're looking at these financial statements?
Yeah. So definitely starting off high level, things you want to look at: level of collections in the practice, how have they looked year to year? Is there growth? Is there a decline? Definitely looking at their high level, also looking at the overhead and the cash available in the practice. That's something we help a lot of buyers with, high level and in depth. But when we're looking more in detail at these statements, we like to look at each line item. So looking at direct expenses like supplies, labs, salaries and wages, but also indirect expenses like repairs and maintenance, computer expenses, kind of, are there personal things being run through here? Are there one-time expenses? And then also looking at different one-off things like rent. How does the seller owning the building play into that? And really just looking at all those different details, educating the buyer on them.
Okay, I think first step is when we look at the detail, right? So you talked about the add back. So those we refer to as discretionary. So we're going to add all of those items back. So the things are basically running through the business, from the payroll tax, maybe of the doctor, the spouse, spousal salary, payroll tax, maybe the children, same thing there. Kind of these normal things that a small business owner would be running through. What else from a big picture are you looking at? We've got obviously the top line and some of these expenses, but I know a lot of times when we do kind of a meeting together prior to taking on a client, we've almost had the pre-huddle before the call. What else are you looking at from the practice perspective?
Yeah, so a lot of things that we kind of talk about beforehand is kind of looking at different statistics of the practice. So looking at production, how much is doctor, how much is hygiene? Is it a healthy hygiene pool? Like you mentioned with the salary and the spouse in the practice, can we break out those wages? Can we tell if we can add that back at this point? Are there obvious ones like meals and entertainment, or things like a rent adjustment that we can add back on the front end to really make the overhead make sense here? Or are there more questions that we kind of need to ask and take a deeper dive into the practice to really understand these pieces? It kind of depends on what do the financials look like, how detailed are they, or what kind of questions do we need to ask.
Obviously, we see lots of different types of financial statements, people that I'd say run a clean financial statement. But we're also looking for, I know, some fluctuations, right? So you may see the $1 million practice that has a 6% supply one year at 60,000, and the next year it's at perhaps 90,000. So what are they doing differently? So what is your team doing to take a look at that and ask, some of those types of questions?
Yeah, so definitely direct expenses are a big thing that we look at, and how there's a change in production and collections and how it relates to these direct expenses. So typically, like you noted, if there's growth in the practice, you'll see these direct expenses maintain the same percentage of collections. That's the goal, but kind of change as a dollar amount with that change in production and collection. So we're always looking for that trend. But if that trend is kind of not happening, we want to ask the question, hey, did something happen? Was there a bulk purchase maybe of supplies in one year and it kind of tread into the next year? That's something we want to understand and note to the buyer, and like, hey, this is the trend we typically like to see, but this is why we're not seeing it.
One of the things I love how our transition department really guides these buyers, but sometimes the practice, we may look at it with that level of detail, understanding the direct and fixed costs, and perhaps examples like 800 collections, and perhaps that the business only nets like 250. And maybe that's not exciting to the buyer, but I like how when you're building out the projections, we're pretty, I would say, conservative in those projections, but it's really cool to see, to take a practice that's doing 800, keeping that same trajectory of direct costs, but now understanding how fixed costs work. Maybe the same level of team is going to be there, and then just show them, hey, perhaps you're only going to make 250 out of the 800, but if you did $1 million and we able to kind of take those same direct costs through and through, now this practice is going to make close to 400. And for that's the buyer's ability to look and see, hey, yeah, I can do that. There's no marketing. All these procedures are being referred out, and so that's that opportunity. And ultimately, that's for them to decide. I know that your team is pretty conservative. We just want to see what it's going to do kind of as of close. But I think that's the cool part of really educating them and giving them, kind of some safe projections. So you've seen, obviously, many brokers do this work as well. So the broker is typically representing the seller. They're giving some type of valuation. They're giving some type of analysis. And what would you say to our buyers with respect to kind of those projections that sometimes the broker, no offense, but they're typically not in the business background. Sometimes it's just a previous dentist or something that's, doing this. But what would you say to kind of watch out for by looking at the broker's projections?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, we do take a more conservative approach in our analysis. And I do think something that I see a lot is brokers making market adjustments to a lot of expenses. So maybe an expense like legal and professional fees or dental supplies ran higher in several years of the practice. And so the broker will make an adjustment to bring it down to what it should be to market. But historically, that's not what the practice spent on it. And we want to make sure we're educating you on that and not adjusting for it unless there was a one-time expense that caused that. But again, we also like to make sure we're looking for those one-time expenses and asking for the general ledgers or asking for the doctor to break out those expenses so we can add them back and add that extra level of detail.
Okay, so for listeners, big picture, $1 million practice, and this broker is now taking market adjustments. So they took the salaries at 35%, say, hey, that should be 30. Hey, they took dental supplies that are 8, it should be 6. Lab, should be 6, and it was at 10. So they're basically saying, hey, here's like another 10% quote unquote profit. Here's like another $100,000, and you're making the decision based on that $100,000 of cash. You're saying, yeah, I'm an associate, I make $250, and now this business is going to yield me $250 based on what the broker said, but that's just not reality. So I think it's a very, very good point and the reason to really ask more questions. Okay, so we've done some education there on the due diligence. Let's just kind of summarize this. What's the most important thing as you kind of step back when you're thinking about the due diligence process? What is like key and what's most important to you?
So we've already talked a lot about education, but it always goes back to education and just teaching the buyer to think about all the things they need to about the practice, ask the questions they don't think to ask, and really just look at it from their point of view and educate them on this is what I'm stepping into. This is what the practice is going to look like for them post-close, because we're here at the beginning before they close. We're looking at it with them, but they're going to be the ones living in it. So we want to make sure they understand truly what the expenses have looked like historically in the practice and really just thinking about all the different things that they might not have considered if they didn't have a team backing them.
Okay, so obviously the majority of work you do, it's even in your title, financial analyst, but give our listeners some non-financial things to consider in the due diligence.
Yep. So definitely we want to look at those non-financial pieces, kind of the operational items of the practice. So looking at what has relationships look like with the staff previously, kind of what do their salaries look like? What do their hours work like? Do they have kids? Are you kind of having that working relationship with them? Also looking at what processes and vendors have they had? Payroll, HR, kind of are you going to use those same processes? Are you going to switch to a different vendor? Kind of giving you the resources to make that decision. And then also making sure you're set up post-close financially, making sure you have the right accounting team, the right planners, anything that you choose to do post-close.
Okay, perfect. I think there's so much emphasis here. Yeah, you just look at the practice, it's going to make $300,000, sure. But there are a lot of communications that are going back and forth. Even from a landlord perspective, that is typically a ton of kind of back and forth. Sometimes we'll get some holdups there to get that to close. What percent would you say of your role is on this non-financial component? Because to me, it's like my first thought is like financial analyst, you're doing 99% of all your work. And there's just like this little bit of kind of operational. We need to think about, these vendor changes, like you said, or let's get the payroll or the doctor working back or working back with the attorney or working back with the accountant. Like, how would you divide your time in a transition consulting role with a client? What do you think that percent is?
I honestly think it can be pretty 50-50 at times. I think there's a lot of financial work on the front end, but as you're kind of building that relationship with the buyer and your client, you're kind of learning more about them and their personality and their goals and how you can kind of coach them to apply those when they're talking to the seller, when they're working with the landlord, trying to really make sure you're setting them up for success to get to close. Because like you said, there's so many communications with the client, with all the different moving pieces in the transition. So really you want to make sure you're not just well-versed on the financial side, but you're also having that consulting, coaching piece and really just setting them up for success.
You're a therapist.
Oh, I try to be sometimes. It seems like I am.
You are the therapist. You're the therapist. You're the coach, the financial analyst. And this is why this low pulsed August can get you to where you need to go, because you do not need high stress. So let's just, are you a caffeine drinker?
I am. I drink about 2 cups of coffee a day. I don't drink a lot of energy drinks, though.
No.
I avoid those. Yeah.
No, this is bad.
Mm-hmm.
This is bad. No, I'm not the fan of the energy. I'm a 2-cupper as well. As I gotten a little older, I sometimes need a cup in the afternoon.
Yeah, the afternoon cup.
The little 3 o'clock. I like the little espresso, maybe a little cortado, just a little bit of that milk in there, and it just gives me that nice little afternoon bump. So I get it. So that gets your pulse back up to in the 50s, if you're going to finish out your day. Okay. So big picture documents. What are we talking about gathering here? So kind of our pre-engagement call. We need a few things. What are we looking for there? And then what's some of the quick analysis that we're doing kind of pre-call and what we're going over with the client?
Yeah. So kind of pre-engagement, we're always looking for the most recent year of financials. So whether that's a P&L, a tax return, production reports. We're a little bit further in 2025, so we're probably going to ask for that as well, kind of see where it's trending. We're going to look at those direct expenses, kind of what are they as a percentage of collections. And then we're also going to look high level. What are they collecting? Has there been any growth, any fluctuations there? And then just high level add backs. So ones we always add back, meals and entertainment, travel, just obvious ones that we can see that we can kind of give a high level overhead on those initial calls.
We didn't rehearse this part. What percent of people do you think that you look at their financials, and what percent do you think that we actually work with?
I would say, I've looked at a lot of financials of initial calls that they don't end up engaging NDP. Maybe 20% end up engaging.
I know.
Yeah.
That is crazy for our listeners to think. That 80% of our time in prep for a client it's a mutual that we don't agree that this makes sense, because many times our buyers are bringing us things that don't make sense. And that's the goal. Our goal is to educate you to say, hey, this is a don't mess it up deal. I know you're working on one that's been over like a year now. That's like, hey, I remember, don't mess it up. And it's crazy to think that you've been working with them for an entire year to get this deal done. But it's a great practice. But there's a lot of people that sometimes we're just not the fit for at that time. So it's always appreciative, obviously, to these buyers and certainly to our team that you put that much of commitment on people that sometimes that don't hire. What would you say when the client engages, and what would you say that I would say shocks them the most from this process of doing due diligence?
So I do think a big thing that kind of shocks our buyers is the level of detail that goes into the analysis process. So if you do end up engaging, you'll likely get an email from me or one of the other analysts with a bunch of really detailed questions about all the line items in the financials. And they might seem tedious, and they are tedious, but they're very helpful in the education process. And we really want to make sure we're covering all of our bases in the education process. So I do think a lot of the times it's like, whoa, I wasn't expecting them to be so detailed, but I do think that's a big piece of it.
Well, it's cool because typically our buyers that go through this process will end up engaging Kane Waters. And so I always put my Kane Waters hat on and I have that interview with them. And I always I can look at the work that was done. I can see the emails. I can see the start date and see the literally hundreds of communications that go on. And I always ask, how's August doing? How is, whoever did the representation, how did they do this? Like, amazing. And it's always the same type of response. They're very detailed, very responsive and very detailed. So sometimes people want that. Sometimes people don't need that and don't care for it. I'm sure there's been many of clients that almost kind of ticked off with, this is too much work. I expect you to do that, right? But in the end, they got to bring the information to us for us to analyze it. So it can be overwhelming, this process. What common questions, concerns, misunderstanding that perhaps a buyer has through this process, that either A, they're doing this on their own, or B, they're doing this with you? So they started off with this mindset of how it was going to work, and then they get to close and it's a little bit different. What type of maybe a feedback or level of detail do you think that, sometimes your either big picture or detail analysis is giving them that's kind of giving me a little bit of shock through this process?
Yeah, I definitely think that a lot of buyers kind of don't understand all the different pieces that go into this. And I do think I've kind of touched on that you don't know what you don't know. And kind of sometimes on these initial calls, there's all these kind of aspects that we like to ask the buyers about, what does work back look like for the seller? Can you do the procedure mix? Kind of all these different things that they might not think about when they first find the opportunity. And then if they end up engaging NDP, there's all the other pieces with the financial diligence that they might not think about, or kind of all the different steps in the process. Kind of when does the LOI come into place? When do I kind of work on these operational items? When do I set up my entity? Kind of all those different pieces that come into play. And when they come into play, I think a lot of our buyers don't understand that piece, and that's why they come to us. But I do think there's kind of a flow to it, and that's kind of our job, is to guide them through all those different moving pieces.
Awesome. Do you think there's examples of perhaps clients that it's harder for them to maybe justify the expense of going through this process, or maybe perhaps a timing of when a financial analyst doesn't really fit into their transition goals? And then maybe an example of perhaps a client that is definitely more like, if you meet this criteria, this is definitely something where you probably should consider hiring a transition consulting team like NDP.
Yeah. So I think on the part of the question where it's what kind of practices make sense for NDP. If it's a very low collection practice, maybe there's not a lot of expenses being run through, there's not a lot of value NDP can add to the financial analysis process, we might not be a good fit there. But if you're also looking at it from a timing perspective, maybe you've already executed an LOI, you've already agreed on a price, you've already agreed on a bunch of terms, kind of the analysis portion that NDP can do might not have as much value. We can always still do cash flow education, but if you're looking to verify price, it's a little bit harder to come back on price when you've already executed that LOI. So preferably, I feel like the easiest clients to work with are ones who they found their opportunity, they kind of asked all the preliminary questions, but they kind of have the time to do the due diligence and kind of let NDP come in, ask more questions, look at the financials, and kind of at that point guide them through the LOI process.
What's that time? So you have a conversation with them on January 1 and they're trying to close in April. That's obviously plenty of time. What's kind of call it a cutoff period? You really need this amount of time to go through this process because it's not just the gathering in your work. It's the banking, it's the lease, it's vendor changes, it's the landlord. There's a lot of components here that have some timing that is tied to it. So what do you think a realistic period for the buyer is?
So I think if everyone's moving super efficiently, the least amount of time you could do it in is probably 60 days.
Okay.
I think preferably we want that 90 days, 120 days to kind of really give people a little wiggle room to kind of take a little bit longer there if they need to, but you can do it in 60 days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So they got to be very motivated. Got the team. It's got to be a motivated seller, motivated buyer. We're not dealing with perhaps issues from, notices that they have to give, any non-competes. They've got liquidity, ready for the purchase, things like that. Okay, awesome. This has been super fun and I think very educational for our buyers, but I'm going to switch it up a little bit and let's do some personal stuff. Okay, so you're recently married.
I am recently married.
What's this young man's name?
So my husband's name is Andrew.
Yes.
Andrew Thompson. I'm still Sandy. I haven't done the change yet.
Okay.
But Andrew Thompson.
What's Andrew do?
So Andrew is a business analyst. He works with firefighters. Their company kind of does the physicals for these firefighters. So he's kind of in the healthcare world. But I met him at A&M. So we're both Aggies.
Business analyst 1, business analyst 2. So you guys just go home and crunch numbers?
I know. We're just math people. I know. It works. It works great. Our budget is great.
I've heard you had an animal or two.
Oh, I have 1 dog and 3 cats, but we like to say the dog is equal to 8 cats because she is 100 pounds. She's a Great Pyrenees. She sheds a lot. The cats are a lot more low maintenance, but Roxy, our dog, is like a child to us.
I like Roxy. That's a good. Roxy is a good name.
Oh yeah.
So who runs the house on the dog and the 3 cats?
So I definitely kind of delegate some of the dog activities to Andrew. I do like to go on the walks and things like that.
Okay.
I'm more the cat person. Andrew wasn't a cat person before he met me. He is now a cat person.
Yeah.
He needed to be a cat person.
This is what happened. Women just somehow hey, it comes with the package, and you just accept it.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's dog, I'm cats.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you guys do for fun? What are some things outside the office you do?
We love to go on walks with Roxy. We love to try new coffee shops. We love to try new restaurants. We're definitely homebodies. We like to do puzzles and board games and kind of be boring, but a lot of our friends live in the area, so we like to hang out with them. All the normal things.
Awesome. This has been such a pleasure. I can't thank you enough for what you do. It's certainly been fun to have kind of our team being interviewed. I think it just allows our listener just to understand just the breadth of knowledge that we have kind of scattered through our team with kind of this one focus of education, this one focus of helping both buyer and seller, truly just understanding the valuation of the business that they own, the valuation that they're going to utilize on the transition to sell, and certainly the valuation of the business that they are going to purchase. So it has been fun, and we were just lucky to have you on the team, and I just so much appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. Have a wonderful day.
Well, thank you, Charles, for leading the way. Thank you, August, for giving us all of your knowledge. I hope you guys enjoyed her debut on Transition Talk and learning a little bit about her. She's amazing if you get the opportunity to work with her. Listeners, the due diligence process is significant. It's critical in understanding what you're buying, understanding what you're going to own, and understanding the opportunity and the risk as every business has. Our team at NDP is here to guide you along the way and, just lean on a professional. That's what we do best. All right, team, that's all we have for today. Thank you for joining us on episode 129 of Transition Talk. As always, make sure to share the transition love with those who may not know of us yet. And of course, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, friends.